Hey everyone, so I wanted to show you a way we can actually simplify this code using a new structure called the for loop. For loop. So I'm going to first show you how you create a for loop. So we're going to take this out right here. I'll leave out the print statement though because that is going to still be useful. So we'll keep that and I'll just put it in a comment. So here's the structure of our for loop. It's going to be for, and we're first going to need, there's going to be three parts of this for loop, and they're each going to be separated. So there's going to be like part one, part two, and part three, just like that. So the first part of the for loop is an initializer, and this initializer is going to return void. So it's not going to return anything. And I guess I misspelled this word. It's probably spelled like that. And then we're going to have a semicolon, and then we're going to have another thing. This is going to be a comparison, and it's going to return a boolean. So it's just going to be an expression that returns a boolean and then a semicolon. And then our last thing is going to be an incrementer, and this is going to be void once again. So basically these two aren't going to return anything, and I guess I also misspelled yet another word. How do you spell this? It's that one. Okay, so initializer, comparison, and then incrementer. So this one's going to be a boolean, and then these two are going to be void, so they're not going to they're basically not going to give us anything. So let's see what that looks like whenever we create it. So we're going to create a for loop, right? And you can see right here, we have these things right here. These are both very useful, and I highly encourage you to check these out and see how to use them. They're basically going to automatically write these structures for you, but I'm going to write it out manually here. So we have for, and we can type in a parentheses. And then for initializer, we want to basically create a value. So we're going to say int, a lot of times, because this number lives, I always say create your numbers with very meaningful names, but because this number lives for such a short amount of time, sometimes people just give it an I, and that's just a very common standard. It means index. So I is our index. So for int I equals 0, that's our initializer. Now we create a comparison, which is going to give us a boolean. So we're going to say I is greater than times. So this right here, of course, is a boolean. And then, of course, we could do our last thing. And so what this boolean does is it's basically the comparison that's saying, like, while this is true, so for int I equals 0, while I is greater than times, and then the incrementer is what we're going to do. So we're going to do I plus plus. And so that's going to increment I by 1 each loop. So while I is greater than times, increment I by 1. So then we can just do our code from before, our system out println hello world, and that is going to basically function the same way, although we don't even need this number variable. Whoopsie. We don't need this number whatsoever. We could just do it like this, and it's going to run it exactly 5 times. What has happened here? Oh my gosh, I'm so dumb. We actually have to say less than times. I bet some of you might have caught that, but I surely didn't. Okay, and we can see that runs 5 times. And just like with the while loop, we could say like this, and this would also run 5 times, because usually you want this to be the number. So you could say 1 and then it's less than or equal to, or you could say 0 and then it's less than. If you're going through, and I'm going to show you how we can use this structure, but it just depends on the circumstance. So let's say we want to print out line numbers, and we can even call this that, so like line number, so we can give our variable a meaningful name now. And then we could say this is line number, and then space plus, and then line number, just like that. And we could try this, and you could see it's going to give us our line numbers. And we don't want to start with 0 for line numbers, but say we have an array, so I'm going to create an integer array, and I'm just going to call it numbers, and we're going to just initialize this with some values, so like that, and I'm going to need to say equals, because I forgot that. 3, 7, 12. We're just going to put in some big numbers, some small numbers, some whatever. Okay, just like that. So let's say we're going through this array, right? We can actually use this for loop to more easily go through it. You could also, of course, use a while loop. And don't forget the semicolon here, by the way. You could also, of course, use a while loop, but we're going to use a for loop to increment through this array because the structure is just a lot shorter for a for loop. So we could say, and for an array, if you remember, array indexes start at 0, so we're going to probably want to start with 0. Let's just give this variable a more meaningful name using f2, and we'll call it index, or I. I'll just leave it as I. And then, instead of having this times, we can use our, and I'm also taking away this, because the end, if you remember, is going to be the index minus 1, so we don't want to be inclusive of the last number. And we could say numbers dot length. This is the length of this array. We could also, of course, count the elements and then subtract 1, but this is a much easier way to basically go through all the elements in an array. And then we could just say, we could go something like this. So array element number, and then we could say plus I plus 1, and we want to make sure we do our order of operations, of course, plus equals, and then we're going to say plus, and then we can index our array using our I. So we'll say numbers I. So we're basically saying array element number, and then we're doing I plus 1. We could also, of course, not do that, so let's just not do that. So we say array element number I equals I plus 1, and we're just going to be writing that out on the screen. That's why all of this is in our quotation marks. So let's see what that does. And that is just going to print out our entire array onto our screen in a much nicer to read format. And we could also increment all of these by 1 just by going plus 1, just like that. And you'll see that has just shifted all these numbers up by 1, but that's it. So there were a total of 10 elements in this array, but this last element is index 9, even though there's 10 elements, because that's how arrays work. They're not like, the last element is whatever the length is minus 1, and so that just makes it really useful for doing this 0 and less than thing. So that is just one of the really useful ways that we can use for loops. And I want to show you what happens if we hadn't had those parentheses there. Let's see what happens real quick. And we're going to see we get a little bug. It says 0, 1, 1, 1. And the reason why this is happening is because this integer right here, I, is being implicitly converted to a string because of the order of operations, and then it's going adding this 1, which is also being implicitly converted to a string. So it's basically saying evaluate this first, then evaluate all of this right here, and it keeps going like that, basically through the order of operations. So it's first turn into a string, this turns into a string, and then to a string. But if we do this, we're saying we want to, this is still an integer. This integer, we're going to add 1 to it and then convert it to a string. So that's the reason why those parentheses there are essential. So that's one of the ways we can go through arrays. And in the next video, I'm going to be showing you an enhanced version of this that will make it even easier to go through all of the elements inside of an array.